Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. What I want to discuss in today's video is how many jhanas are there in early Buddhism. These are these states of deep meditative absorption that the Buddha used to attain enlightenment, the jhanas. Well, you're going to hear me say this and you're going to say, Doug, you're a fool. There's 4 jhanas. You've already done a video on the 4 jhanas, so what are you talking about? Well, it's not so simple. In some suttas, it seems like there are 5, and there's some disagreement on whether there are 8 or 9. There's a whole bunch of different disagreements if we look at Buddhism in general about how many jhanas there are. Now, to be fair, a lot of this just depends upon verbiage, what words we use. In the later tradition, not only the 4 jhanas I've discussed were called jhanas, but also the 4 formless attainments were called jhanas. They were called the formless jhanas some places. And even there's something called the 9th jhana, which is the cessation of perception and feeling. So, yeah, okay, you're going to say, Doug, that's not really very interesting. Of course, we can use the word jhana to describe things that weren't called jhanas in early Buddhism. But there's a deeper issue here. If we look at traditional lists of the jhanas, Lee Brasington has a list of things that people have called jhanas back, in different times. We'll see that there are, of course, different ways that people name things. However, there's one aspect of this list and these lists that is a little deeper than a simple issue of naming. Now, if we'll recall, the first jhana, as well as a bunch of other things, includes 2 aspects called Vitakka and vicāra in Pali. Now, what exactly Vitakka and vicāra mean is something of a question. Some scholars believe that originally Vitakka and vicāra were simply 2 words for the same thing, meaning essentially something like thinking and pondering. Other scholars believe that the later connotations of these 2 terms is prevalent throughout Buddhism. That is to say that Vitakka means placing the mind on its object, and vicāra means keeping its mind where it's been placed. These are 2 different mental operations, the placing of the mind and the keeping it placed, and that they were always, that this distinction was there from the beginning. So, in any event, we know that in the first jhana, these 2, Vitakka and vicāra, are present. There is an active mental operation of some kind. However, in the second jhana, as I've described it on my past videos, and indeed the way it's normally described, both of these are missing. So Vitakka and vicāra have evaporated. These mental operations don't persist anymore. And indeed, that's what typifies the second jhana. We know that we're in the second jhana when these mental operations have ceased. And then in the second jhana, we're only left with these pleasant states of rapture and bliss. In the first jhana, we had the rapture and bliss plus the Vitakka and vicāra, these mental operations. In the second jhana, the mental operations die away, which means the mind becomes quieter, and we're only left with the bliss and state of rapture, or this kind of bubbling sort of pleasure. If we've seen the videos that I've done on jhana, we'll sort of be familiar with this. However, as I say, there is something of a problem here. And this problem is perhaps best illustrated in a sutta called the Upakkilesa Sutta, in which the Buddha describes his difficulty in overcoming the mental hindrances in order to attain jhana. So he goes through all the difficulty he had attaining the first jhana and so on and so forth. It's a long sutta about his sort of overcoming, basically about his early practice and the overcoming of these problems he had, I should say. And then, having overcome the hindrances, he goes on to say, I've given up my mental corruptions, or these hindrances. Now let me develop immersion, or samadhi, in 3 ways. I developed immersion while placing the mind and keeping it connected, without placing the mind, but just keeping it connected, and without placing the mind or keeping it connected, with rapture, without rapture, with pleasure, with equanimity. And then, having gone through this process, the Buddha describes how he became enlightened. So he became enlightened basically based on this process. So the one odd thing here is that the Buddha describes how he's going to attain samadhi in 3 ways, and then mentions 7 ways. This apparent incongruity here leads Analayo to think that the last 4, therefore, were added on, that they're sort of a later addition, that originally they would have just been the first 3. And indeed, if we look at a different sutta from the early tradition, the Samgiti Sutta, we find just those 3 listed as a particular part of the sutta. That is, samadhi with placing the mind and keeping it connected, samadhi without placing the mind but just keeping it connected, and samadhi with neither placing the mind nor keeping it connected. Now, samadhi without placing the mind or keeping it connected, that is, without vitakka and vicāra, includes the last 3 jhanas. In other words, these mental operations are ceased in the last 3. And the first, as we've already seen, is the first jhana. But the issue here is this middle one, this second one. This is a state in between the first and the second jhana, where the mind is no longer having to place itself on its object, but is simply having to keep it connected to that object, to keep it on the object itself. So, just to make this a little clearer, I think we all have had the experience in meditation of following the breath. And there's going to be an operation where, let's say, we're thinking about something else, the mind has drifted, then the mind becomes aware that it's drifted, and there's an activity of the mind where we bring it back to the breath. This is going to be the vitakka, that first kind of mental operation. Once we bring it back to the breath, then there is the second mental operation of keeping it connected to the breath, of holding the mind calm or still on the breath. So what we have here is essentially a list of 5 jhanas. The first one, we're both trying to keep it connected, we're bringing it back and keeping it connected. The second one, we're no longer having to bring it back, but just keep it connected. And the third one, we're not doing either one. The mind is simply stable on its own. And importantly, this is not the only sutta in which we find this kind of 5 jhana progression. Indeed, we find it in a couple of other suttas, and we find it in Chinese translations of some of these suttas. We even find a similar kind of idea in the Abhidhamma Kosha Bhashyam, which is a much later text that's not in the Pali tradition. And indeed, most famously perhaps, it's also taken up in the Abhidhamma of the Pali tradition, which is to say that it's taken up much later by people who are trying to systematize how jhana is to be understood. Now, many scholars believe that this idea of there being 5 jhanas is a later kind of concept, that it comes out of the Abhidharma and then was introduced back into the texts by some of these Abhidharma scholars, which is to say that the texts that we find in the suttas that include it may be late. In other words, they may have been produced after the development of the Abhidharma had begun. However, as I've just said, we find this idea of there being 5 jhanas in both the Pali tradition and in the non-Pali tradition, which suggests that if this development of there being 5 jhanas is late, it's not very late. It predates sectarianism. It predates the time at which there was a split between the Pali tradition and the non-Pali, what eventually would become the Mahayana. Now, another fact here is this idea of there being 5 jhanas would have to have occurred at a time at which vitakka and vicāra meant completely different things. If they both meant thinking, if it was thinking and pondering, there would be no reason to split the first jhana into two, or there would be no reason to have an intermediate jhana between the first and second, because thinking and not pondering, that doesn't mean anything. So, if indeed these terms initially were synonymous, then indeed this split into 5 jhanas would have had to have been something that happened somewhat later, once they took on the meanings that we know them by today as fixing the mind and keeping it connected. So here's the question. Were there originally 5 jhanas that got simplified into 4 over time? In other words, 5 became too unwieldy, they became simplified into 4, and then the remnants of that 5 jhana original fact got picked up by some people in the abhidhamma and disseminated into the abhidhamma? Or is it instead the case that there were originally 4 jhanas, and that some very persnickety abhidhamma person thought, oh, there's a split that we can make between these two, and so let's add a 5th jhana, and that got reintroduced to the text at a later period? Or, third, is it perhaps the case that both of these were around at the same time? That perhaps even the Buddha described these in different ways to different audiences? That perhaps some practitioners found that there were 5 states they could go into and others didn't? These are questions that are not really easily resolvable. I think most scholars believe, as I understand it, that the 4 jhana process is the more original, and that the 5 jhana process is somewhat later, but it's hard to say for sure. But it does lead us to the awareness that something as apparently canonical and straightforward and simple as jhana was actually somewhat more fluid in the early tradition than we might otherwise think. And this is one of the reasons why it's so useful to look at some of these early suttas carefully, because it can lead us to understand ways that the early Buddhist practice involved, again, a more fluid understanding of the terms and conditions and all the rest than we might otherwise think if we simply came to a very cut and dried kind of summary of early Buddhism. And for another kind of topic that was also fluid and one that was a question at the time of early Buddhism and became more of a question afterwards, I have an earlier video on the topic of sudden versus gradual enlightenment, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much for all of your help and support over the last many years, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.